Greetings, everybody, and welcome to This is Revolution. My name is Jean Badgelan, in for Jason Miles this evening for this special Wednesday night stream, which is taking place under very unfortunate circumstances. And tonight we will be discussing the earthquake in Turkey, but also we'll be providing you with information about how you might be able to assist, as well as links which you can find in the description to various charities that are conducting aid work both in Turkey as well as in the affected parts of Syria at the moment. So, this is a really tragic event that's taken place. And, I hope tonight we'll be able to really explain to people the immense scale of this disaster that has struck not only Turkey, but also Syria, and also a part of the world that has been racked by conflict over the last, few decades. And, this is really coming home. Before we begin and before I bring on the panel and our guest today, I want to share with everybody, all of our friends in Turkey and in Syria and around the Middle East who have been affected by this tragedy, a kind of a special message. Yani özel bir mesajımız var. Yani Kürdistan, Türkiye ve Suriye'deki yoldaşlarımıza özel bir mesajımız var. Bu deprem büyük bir felaket. Bu zor zamanlarında en mühim şey tavrında. Acımız çok büyük. Yüreğimiz deprem bölgesinde. Ölenler Allah'tan rahmet. Hayatını kaybedenlerini yakınlara başsağlığı, yaralı olanlara acil şifalara dileriz. Muazzam halklarımıza geçmiş olsun. So, with that, I'd like to bring on our panel. We have with us tonight, of course, TIR regular C. Derek Vaughn. Hi, Vaughn. How are you doing?
Boo.
Boo. We also have our representative from the Deep State, Cuba. Cuba, how are you?
Peace and greetings, everyone.
And joining us from New York, we have Professor of History, Ayşe Baltacıoğlu Brema. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So, as a citizen of Turkey, I want to ask you, obviously you've been following this event, very closely, and I'm just going to put a little picture up to show that people where the earthquake has taken place. So as you can see, this is on the Mediterranean coast. The center is in Maraş, Antep, Eskenderun, Malatya, Adıyaman, a relatively poor and underdeveloped region of the country. And of course, its effects have been felt in Syria as well, which has been, devastated by war over the last decade as well, and is less able to cope with this tragedy. So, what kind of things are you seeing? What's going on? What kind of issues are people facing in this crisis?
Where to start? There's a lot going on, and it is really heartbreaking to see what has happened and what is happening in Turkey and also northern Syria. The earthquakes, two very strong earthquakes that happened by 9-hour difference, really shook a big part of the southeastern Turkey and northern Syria. As far as I know, like a 300-mile radius. And as you mentioned, this is the part where the development hasn't been as good as some other major cities like Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir in Turkey. And other thing that is that in a lot of millions of people's minds, this really was a big reminder of the past, the previous big earthquake that shook Turkey in 1999, in August 1999, that killed 17,000 people according to the official numbers, but unofficial numbers are up to 30,000 people. And that was a huge, terrifying experience. And a lot of people thought that we were actually building better. The building codes were better, standards were better, technology was better, and nobody thought that the earthquake, a similar earthquake, would actually cause even more death than what it did in 1999. And here we are. The official number as of now is around 13,000 death, and that is only going to increase. And the estimates are between 50,000 to 100,000 in terms of what people are expecting to see at the end of the week, because there are still thousands of people under the rubbles. They are day by day dying, if nothing else, by frigid weather, because it has been also extremely cold in this part of the country, unseasonably cold, and that is not helping as well. Everybody is devastated, but soon after the earthquake, the sadness was accompanied by anger, a big anger, because people realized that a big chunk of this devastation was avoidable, and seeing that and realizing that really made people angry in so many levels. And the lack of trust, I will say, to the government and government related agencies. People really didn't know what to do, where to go, how to reach out to the people to help them. And just to give you an idea, right now, both within Turkey and beyond Turkey, the most trusted um, the organization is something called Ahbab, and I think it is also listed under in the description here, and it is led by a singer turned to an activist in Turkey, Haluk Levent. And he has been really a big help to individual people in small communities who were struggling with certain economic issues. But this is really too big to be handled by just one guy, and whatever infrastructure he was able to build in the last couple years. This is something that you will really need a strong state with its organizations and institutions. And that is not there. And today, actually, there was a tweet that the head of this Ahbab, Haluk Levent, shared a video where two ministers, two secretaries of I don't remember what, but they actually were getting briefings from Haluk Levent in terms of how things are on the ground and what type of efforts are needed. And it is supposed to be the other way around. A guy, an activist, a charity organization will go to the state and ask, what is there to be done? Tell us what to do. But the situation right now on the ground is really, really bad, that the state is going and getting briefings from an artist turned to activist and a charity person to get information in terms of what needs to be done. And thousands of people are still waiting for help.
And you mentioned, so we've talked. You mentioned the numbers of people who have already been recorded as dying in this tragedy, and also the large number of people who are still missing underneath the rubble in in these cities. And I just want to let people know I was considering showing some people showing pictures of this, but I kind of don't think that's particularly useful at this moment. People can go and look at the level of devastation that's taking place. You've seen these large apartment blocks have fallen down. People have been buried underneath this. But it's not only the people who have died, but also the survivors are in a deep crisis as well, because utilities are non-functioning. The state is apparently inconsistent in terms of how it's responding in different parts of the region. This crisis has affected places as far away as Eskenderun, which is on the Mediterranean coast, and Diyarbakir, which is in the heart of Turkey's Kurdish region as well, where you've had major disasters, and the state capacity to deal with any of this. For the survivors who don't have shelter, who are suffering from this unseasonal cold, many people have fled from the cities to the villages, and the villages are unable to cope. They don't have the resources to feed and clothe people, and if things don't change relatively soon, people will start dying. There's risks of disease spreading, issues with food and medicine. And let's not forget as well, this particular region that has been affected was also home to a large number of extremely impoverished Syrian refugees who who were living in this region. So many of the dead may not even be counted because they aren't registered Turkish citizens as well. So we have this humanitarian disaster, not just from the earthquake, but also from the fallout for the earthquake and the apparent slow response. As you mentioned, it's civil society organizations that have been responding, but they simply don't have the capacity that the state has.
Exactly.
From what I've read, the Turkish military has not been mobilized adequately.
Now, yes, the government really took its time, and I think in a disaster like that, the first 24 hours is really critical, because it has the time that you can reach out to as many people alive as possible under the rubble, and the country went through this several times. So this is not like the earthquake is happening for the first time and the government doesn't know what to do with it or about it. But the first 24 hours, they really downplayed it. They really didn't even release accurate information in terms of the size of the damage and how many people were affected by that, and how many buildings were collapsed. And the army was not put into a mission to reach out to people and the collapsed buildings. And when people, civil society, and even like individuals like you and me, when they wanted to go and help, they weren't also able to do that because most of the roads were damaged, and the airport in Antakya, which is one of the most recent airports that was built in the country, damaged in a way that it is not possible to use anytime soon. The bridges and many other infrastrucral buildings damaged. So now increasingly the army is on the field. The soldiers are helping, but the first 24 hours there were only a little around 3,500 soldiers who were tasked to go and help, which is a ridiculously small number. Turkey they have been bragging about being the second largest army in NATO, having around 1 million people in the army. And when you brag about, oh, we sent 3,500 soldiers to help, it is really a slap on the wrist that this is not, you are not taking this seriously. And that really hurts, that a lot of people who could have been actually saved if enough resources were dispatched right away, right after. I think a lot of tragedies would have been avoided, but this wasn't the case. And refugees is an extremely important point. There is over 4 million refugees in Turkey, and the estimates is that around 1 million of that 4 million is in the region that is hit by the earthquake. And who knows how many of them. And the statistics tell us that they are poorer, they live in more impoverished parts of the towns and the cities. They are going to live in more crowded places, and who knows, actually we are even get an accurate number in terms of how many refugees died and got injured.
Van, Kuba, questions and thoughts?
One other characteristic, one other part of the story of the area that's been hit by this earthquake is that also it went through the most severe experience during the anti-ISIS campaign. On the Syrian side, with the YPG forces, and on the Turkish side, the militarization of the border, the smuggling networks in order to move material for ISIS. Do you think that that's a factor on the Syrian side of the border and places like Aleppo that were nearly leveled during the war? Of course, that adds to the devastation and reduces the ability of local groups to organize. But on the Turkish side, do you think there is something left behind from the war with ISIS, either in the local structures or social groups, or is it just another part of Turkey except a little bit poorer?
I don't know how the fight against ISIS or the operations that were conducted beyond the border would affect the situation right after the earthquake. When you look at the center of the earthquake, the cities of Kahramanmaraş, Gaziantep, and Malatya, these are the cities that the AKP government is the strongest. So there's really not a situation where you will say that, well, the government is punishing these places because they are not getting enough votes. This is where the government is the strongest. So I think they really thought that they could. And there are multiple scenarios, and one that they are so living in their own bubble that they had no idea, and they also got caught very badly. And the other scenario is that they knew how bad it was from the beginning, but they thought they can manage it in a way that not many people will hear, or not as many people as now would hear about that. Just to give you an idea, today for 10 hours, Twitter and Facebook were shut down in Turkey by the government. The access to Twitter and Facebook were shut down. And the reason for that was misinformation, dissemination of misinformation about the earthquake. But what actually was happening, that the government was trying to punish or trying to shut people's mouths who have been complaining about the inadequacies of the government, or the inefficiencies of the government, the level of corruption, and how this was avoidable, and it happened, and they did not like that. And rather than trying to channel all their resources and efforts to send as many people as possible, as many teams as possible to the places where the earthquake hit, they had the time to think about this and come up with a strategy, shut internet down, shut Twitter and Facebook down for people who have been also using it to basically locate themselves, sending signals and tweets saying that I am under the rubble, I am here, I am in this building, I am in this street, I am still alive. And thousands of people used social media for this purpose, basically this purpose, or to ask people help, that I have my mom and dad in this town, I cannot go because the roads are blocked, can you go and check on them? This was the only way for a lot of people when the phone lines were not working, when electricity was gone. And they had the time and effort. This is the part that I cannot grasp. I cannot put my head around that. In a situation like that, when we are talking about thousands of people's lives are lost, and they have time to think about a strategy like that, to me it shows that they really are afraid. They really know that this is the last nail on the coffin. I think there's a saying like that in English. And now they just are terrified. And I was saying that to Jane, they are terrified, but it also means that they are going to be terrifying. Because when you have a lot to lose, when you are in power for over 20 years, when you are controlling every single source and revenue for 20 years, giving up, just I don't think they can handle that. And I think this was just a sign of that they thought they could just slow down and shut down internet and shut up people's mouths, so they wouldn't complain about what's happening and what they are seeing on the ground.
You mentioned the previous earthquake in 1999 and how the AKP hasn't learned anything from it. There was standards didn't improve. There was no enforcement of building codes and no response, no adequate response. Civil society groups have had to step up. I think that when it comes to shutting down the internet, that's a lesson they learned from the attempted coup a few years ago, 2015.
16.
It's 2016.
And the preoccupation with maintaining power is clearly a stronger force in the AKP leadership than disaster preparedness or saving lives.
Yeah. They repeatedly cut the budget for the disaster relief funds, as if we are prone to, the countries prone to these disasters, instead of increasing their budgets, instead of actually making them more complex and sophisticated with their technologies and human sources and whatever is needed. But they actually cut the budget.
Is there an association between Syrian refugees and disaster relief? Kind of narrative that this isn't going to help
Yes,
real.
I will say the vast majority, what I'm able to see on Twitter, the vast majority of people are really doing their best, whatever they can, to reach out to people, regardless of their religion, regardless of their ethnicity and language, etc. But there also have been some people who have been showing their ugly sides. And of course, the first name that comes to mind is the head of this political party in Turkey, called Zafer Partisi, which is Victory Party, or however you want to translate it. Maybe, Jenny, you have a better translation. And he is the anti-immigrant voice in Turkey right now. And he is the one who is still talking about how how refugees are plundering the stores in Antakya, how the refugees and immigrants, illegal immigrants, are coming and taking what is not theirs. Luckily, not enough people, not a lot of people are listening to this monstrosity, but they exist. Unfortunately, they exist, but they are the minority. Luckily, they are the minority.
I mean, yeah, this is Umit Özdağ,
Yes.
who, although his party is very small, it has a disproportionate influence on the political discourse in Turkey. But I think one thing that is actually important to understand, although Syria was not at the epicenter of this earthquake, the war combined with the sanctions, have magnified how that disaster has affected places like Idlib, places like Afrin, which are under Turkish administration. The YPG controlled regions were relatively lightly hit. They don't have too many high-rise buildings, etc. But in Idlib and Afrin, which are under Turkish administration, the crisis is magnified by the fact that, as far as I can tell, and perhaps this is incorrect at this present time, in face of the disaster in Turkey, the resources that the Turkish state was spending in these regions was withdrawn to the Turkish side of the border as well. So you have these regions which have been effectively de facto integrated into Turkey over the last couple of years, are now abandoned to fend for themselves as the Turkish state redeploys its resources to deal with the crisis taking place inside the borders of Turkey. As soon as the crisis is hit, this kind of gradual expansion of Turkey has reversed in a bizarre way, as they've had to, as Mao says, the paper tiger has been exposed. Van, do you have any thoughts? Ron, can you hear me? You've gone silent.
As paper tigers go, it seems like it's taken a while to explode, but natural and national disasters tend to do that, right? I mean, for narcissistic Americans, they can think of the Katrina moment. The question, though, becomes like, how long can they possibly sustain this narrative and not deal with the actual damage of the earthquake? And I don't have any idea. Last time I was in Turkey was right before the coup, the attempted coup, which ended up kind of in a counter coup, finally getting all the Kemalists out of the government. But it seems to me like the Justice and Development Party, the AKP, has weathered almost as catastrophic stuff before and come out on top. This seems a little different, and I'm not quite sure why it seems different.
Yes, you're absolutely right that this is not the first moment of crisis in Turkey. And each time people, particularly the critics of AKP, thought that, oh, this must be the end of them, because look, how are they going to survive that? And they did. And to me, each time they survived, they became stronger, and they really institutionalized the way with which they survived these crises. And the change in the system, getting rid of the whole position of prime minister in Turkey, consolidating every single power under the name of president, getting rid of certain parts of the constitution. This really created a system where you really cannot do much. And one of the major moments of victory for the critics of the government was the local elections, where the municipality in Istanbul and Ankara, they lost, and the main opposition parties candidates won. And that was the moment where people thought, okay, maybe some things can change. And of course, this is another one of those moments, and because people are also comparing it with the 1999 earthquake that really created a huge wave of criticism towards the government. And in 1990s, the Turkish politics was a mess. The whole 1990s, it was a series of coalition governments, one after another, and inflation skyrocketed in a comparable way to now. Basically, how actually Erdogan came to power in early 2000s is directly related to what happened in the 1999 earthquake and aftermath. And they are aware of that. They are aware of the power of a disaster like this. And it is not surprising that now the major mouths of AKP supporters started to talk about, oh, maybe this is not the right time to do the elections, because the elections are scheduled to happen in May. And if it happens in May, this earthquake and the aftermath is still going to be fresh in people's minds. And now you see that they are starting to talk about, bring this up with op-eds, or major supporters of the government writing in media outlets that are bought or supported or patronized by the government, saying that, well, this is not the right time to do elections. Maybe we should postpone it to March 2024, when there will be an election, local election anyways. So this is to me an attempt to try to push the election as far as possible, to make sure they are not suffering from the outcome of the earthquake. And they are going to try that. And to be honest, if they want to, there's really not much to stop them. Now there is martial law in these cities, and for 3 months, Erdogan, if he wants to, single-handedly can extend it for another 3 months. He can make it a nationwide martial law, and once you do that, the elections are gone. So, and there's nothing to support him. There's nothing to hold him accountable to a move like that. And a lot of people are now afraid that this is where it is going.
Although state of emergency didn't stop them holding a referendum, of course.
Yeah, of course.
When it was convenient to them to hold the referendum. But I think that's a really important point. You know, the 90s was a period of crisis in Turkey. You know, you'd had a relative stability under Turgut Özal in the 80s, some benefits for certain elements of Turkish society with neoliberalization, you know, and then in the 90s, there was this kind of faltering, this economic crisis, coalition governments. The war with the PKK really heated up during this period, and people got sick of it, right? And the nail in the coffin was this earthquake, and people elected the AKP as a kind of clean hands administration. Now, whether they always had this plan or they came to this plan in power is, you know, people debate that, but I kind of think it's, even if they did come with the best of intention, power corrupts, you know, and they've been in power for a long time. And I think, you know, the meta picture that we're seeing is that in this last 20 years, there has been a facade of development. There has been real development. Like for the first 10 years, you know, the AKP were winning elections not really by playing on culture wars, but by saying, we built this hospital, we did this. Do you want to go back to the 90s? They did provide concrete material gains for their supporters. Turkish development has historically favored people in Western Anatolia, in Ankara, in Istanbul. There has been, people often talked about the headscarf issue as being a religious issue, which it is to a certain extent, but it was a class issue. People don't like people from Tashra coming into their spaces, the people from the countryside coming into spaces and making it look, making you eat lahmacun and, look like a peasant from Anatolia. There was a very strong class dynamic to that. These people did provide that level of development, and really for the first time in Turkish history created a national political party that could win votes from Hakkari all the way to Tekirdağ, right? But, the flip side of this is there has been, especially in the last 10 years, an utter degeneration of the institutions of the Turkish state, which, however authoritarian and top-down those institutions were, there was a kind of institutional memory going back to the reforms of the Tanzimat. Like these weren't institutions created, 10 years ago. All these bureaucratic institutions predated the foundation of the republic. And that balance of power, there was a oligarchy, and an institutional conflict. There was, but in the last 20 years, the paradigm has shifted, and the coup was really, the last bastion of independence, as it were, from the AKP was finally taken over. So what comes with that is the cronyism, the corruption, and the hollowing out. And we talk about this a lot on This Is Revolution, happening in the West as well. The hollowing out of institutions, and a kind of, we have a saying in England, all fur coat and no knickers. So like, it's all show, but there's nothing underneath it. And all this development that we've seen, which was impressive on the face of it, so much of it has just literally fallen down in 10 seconds, right? All these high-rise apartments, because it looked, I think, to many people, the AKP was solving the Gecekondu issue, the favelas that were existing on the edge of the city. When I lived in Turkey, you could see the physical changes taking place in the country, right? But it's kind of run out of steam, and everything seems to be increasingly cheap and rushed. And behind that whole thing is that these institutions that sustained the Turkish state, that made it a relatively strong state in a region where you had relatively weak states, those institutions have now been hollowed out and turned. The parliament is now basically just a function of the AKP. Whenever the opposition gains ground in the local elections, powers are taken away from them, or if they're Kurdish, they get replaced by trustees, by essentially appointed officials. So everything there's a complete hollowing out of the state, and you can kind of hide that for a while, but it really comes to a head when you face this kind of crisis. And as you pointed out, one of the big sources of anger against the coalition government that took power, I think, in 1999 under Ecevit, was the failure to mobilize the army, the inadequate response. Now, that government didn't have the capacity to stay in office. It was a coalition government, right? This government now is officially a coalition government, but is it really a coalition government? Even the MHP, which is the far right party in Turkey, is now hollowed out, right? It's now just been an appendage of the presidential system, which has been established. The AKP, which had liberal factions, it had many different leaders in the first decades. It's now they had a 3-term limit on the MPs. Once all the old guard of MPs left, they brought in all their new guard of MPs who were loyal to the leader. So the political institutions have been mobilized, and the AKP has been successful with this facade, but also by playing off the opposition against one another. which the opposition has proved itself, at least until this moment, incapable of mounting any meaningful resistance to the government. But now this seems to be like this could be a real game changer, because this is like a bomb dropped in the center of the heartland of AKP support.
I guess I have a couple of questions and some parallels to kind of draw out for people who don't know the regional history as well. One thing that the AKP has associated with it that most kind of semi-insurgent outsider groups that take over a government don't is the ability to utilize the full state apparatus to suspend elections, etc. You normally associate this with like Nasserist in the Egyptian military, who were able to do this, and their 90-day rules of emergency that last, I don't know, the first one lasted 30 years, and the current one has lasted since 2006-17 until probably the death of al-Sisi. But the AKP is different from a lot of soft Islamist groups, and that's how it's often portrayed in America, as a soft Islamism, which I think is somewhat misleading, but that's my personal opinion. And that it seems to be able to wield the apparatus of the state in ways that other groups that have been in similar positions in the region have not been able to do. And yet it also seems to have hollowed out its state apparatus largely for ideological apparatchiks, which is usually a bad sign for a party's ability to hold on to power. So that is very different than the other states in the region of the Middle East. Also doesn't really resemble Europe in any way, in any meaningful sense. How does the AKP hold on to that much institutional power while also not seemingly having any, long-standing deep apparatus underneath it to maintain its own administrative base?
This is a very good question, and there are different layers to answer that. But I think one of the first things that come to mind is that there's still this veneer of democracy, that it is not like there was a coup and Erdogan came to power and he was the head of a military, and he staged a coup, and then now he's the president. He was elected and elected again and elected again. And even though you can talk about certain mishaps in the elections, and in particular local elections that I think are more prone to corruption and rigging in that sense, like we all know what happened in Ankara in the not this last election but the one before. But when you look at the general elections, you really cannot talk about like big rigging, and you cannot talk about, like they didn't have the vote and they are still ruling, so they are lacking the legitimacy. So if you look at that, people have been voting for this party, and in significant numbers. And the very first time after 2003, the very first time people actually thought that there was now a legitimate alternative was 2015, where the vote of AKP for the first time was below 40%. And what happened? The country found itself in a war in a couple months with PKK. And at the end of that, the elections were renewed. And that 39% got to 51% very quickly. So because the Erdogan is a shrewd politician. He's not dumb. He's actually very smart. And his shrewdness and his intelligence and him knowing when to act and how to act is one of the major reasons for him to be able to come here to this moment and actually stay there and become as popular as he is. One of the major problems that we are seeing in this earthquake that is now displayed very openly in front of our eyes is that Erdogan has had ambitions beyond Turkey. And of course, we all know that with this military activities in northern Syria, and he has so much ambition into going all the way to Aleppo. But his ambitions in the international scene is much larger than what he wants to do in Syria. what he has been doing in Africa, what he has been doing in places like Pakistan and Bangladesh, in Central Asia, with what we call now is Turkish soft power, through construction companies, through Turkish TV shows, through aids, through schools, has really created an image for him in the international level as well, where he is revered, he's respected, actually much more internationally than he is within the country. I live in New York and I use Uber and Lyft all the time, and whenever I have an ability or an opportunity to talk to the guy driving the car, it's like, where are you from? And they are from Bangladesh and Pakistan and Senegal and Mali and Burkina Faso, and they all love Erdogan. They all love him. They think he is the God-sent person. And the last one that I actually met, a guy from Western Africa, was showing me his jacket, saying that up until Turkish stuff arrived, we were using made in China and it was rubbish. And now look, everything is so much higher quality, and we love Erdogan. We love Erdogan. He is the leader. I wish our leader was like him. But what happened was that at the end, resources are limited. You cannot be what you want to be internationally, but also within the country. And he was chipping away from resources within the country to invest in Western Africa, in Pakistan, and in Bangladesh. And he never thought that something like that, a big earthquake, would reveal what was happening behind the scenes. And this is what happened to him. And hopefully it is going to be enough to reveal the level of corruption in the country. But I am not as optimistic as I want to be.
I would be curious if the countries that had been receiving Turkish aid, especially for construction projects, don't revisit and reinspect the sites that have been handed over, because this is also going to be a tremendous blow for Turkish soft power. If this kind of response follows a major disaster in country, then it fundamentally shifts the view of Turkish competence and capability.
Exactly. And Turkish construction has been huge. Turkish construction companies have been leading any major construction project where you have in Africa, you have in Arabian Peninsula, in the Middle East, in Central Asia, in South Asia. And if I were them, I would now check my sources again to see, did they really deliver what they were supposed to do? And
I mean, this is what's been happening. I mean, the Turkish construction sector is, notorious for its corner cutting. Now, after the Düzce earthquake in 1999, there was a whole, rigmarole about improving building safety, having more earthquake preparedness. But with the building safety, well, we've seen, these you have these big construction moguls, these big construction companies that have been getting government tenders. There have been these huge infrastructure projects, which have been the basis of AKP support. They provide employment for millions of people. You've had these vanity big projects that have been cheapened by the use of extensive Syrian labor to build the mega projects as well. But it's all very impressive. Mosque, I used to joke that Justice and Development Party's metric of development was mosques and shopping centers, right? Like how many mosques and how many shopping centers, how many smitsarais are there around the place? Does it look nice? And they benefited because Turkey has been able to export its brands, its businesses to markets that Western companies are too afraid to go to. One of Turkey's biggest trading partners is Iraqi Kurdistan, right? You go to Iraqi Kurdistan today, it might as well just be Turkey. There's Ziraat Bankası, there's everything, every brand company that you can find from Turkey is in Erbil, is in Süleymaniye. You can go to, like all these chain restaurants that have become popular. It's, Turkish capitalist civilization is spread across the region. But, the price of that cheap construction, it seems to have been that these big companies have been cutting corners. And what's fallen down? We've seen the Belediye buildings falling down. We've been seeing the hospitals
Yes.
falling down,
Airports.
airports falling down. These are government construction projects that have been tendered out to people who have close relationship with the a close relationship with the government, and we've come to this kind of endpoint. Erdogan, as you noted earlier, he is a master politician. He was able to pose as a liberal for a certain period of his rule, and I think a lot of us were. I think especially a lot of people who had suffered under the Kemalist system, they saw it as that perhaps this is the real bourgeois revolution. We're going to have parliament democracy because now the state, which has been the oppressive organ on Turkey, has been subjugated to the democratically elected politicians. But that period of liberalism in Turkey, in retrospect, I kind of see as that was because there was a big fight taking place over control of all the elements of government. And when that fight was concluded, there was a crisis, 2015. AKP lost support. And what Erdogan did was completely reorientate his social base. He's always had this heterogeneous social base. Early AKP was, poor people from Anatolia, pissed off liberals, liberal Muslims, and Kurds, all in one pot. And then when that became no longer the convenient political vehicle, he moved on to in and out, far right Turkish nationalism, Milli Görüş kind of politics as well. He's been able to play this, and he's been able to use foreign policy, such as the wars in Syria, to keep the opposition divided. Because without a coalition of CHP, İYİ Partisi, and HDP, there is not really an opposition, right? They don't have either one of the. I mean, there are these other political forces which are just kind of, just for show. But those are the three main political forces, and they just cannot coalesce together. And Erdogan is continuously playing on things that divides them, right? So the heating up of the war with the PKK was very convenient, right? Because it broke off one branch and made opposition more difficult. Now, what will we see? What kind of opposition we'll see? And I think, but what you mentioned earlier as well is important. Turkey, with the presidential system, with the complete subjugation of all the judiciary, the parliament, the military, how and why would these guys leave power, right?
Exactly. I mean, there have been two major instances where people thought that now there's a legitimate opposition figure because Erdogan has been a charismatic politician, a smart one. He is a good orator and he knows how to talk and how to manipulate, etc. And the first one was Demirtas, the head of HDP, and he's in jail. He has been in jail the last 2.5 years. The other one is Ekrem İmamoğlu, who is the mayor of Istanbul right now.
Who's about to go to jail.
Yes, and he's banned from politics. He's now, because he was sued. He was put on a court because of a derogatory, so to speak, or belittling public officials, like a very made up charge in a ridiculous way, and he was tried in a very quick trial, and he got a sentence, and he's not going to serve it now, but attached to his sentence was that he is banned from politics. Now he's waiting. There's some appealing processes, etc. for that. But what Erdogan did was to block, or what Erdogan has been doing is to identify political figures who have the potential to emerge as significant alternatives to him and block them and make sure they cannot run against him. And Demirtas was the first one. and İmamoğlu is the second one, unfortunately.
It sounds very similar to the consolidation of authoritarianism in Russia under Putin.
Yes.
These similarly started out.
Exactly. And or creating a client network with oligarchs who are extremely rich, but their richness is so closely tied to their relationship with the core. These construction companies that Jane mentioned, they are extremely rich, extremely well to do, and they are extremely tied to the government, and they are oligarchs. We don't use it for people who are not in the Russian system, but they are technically oligarchs. If you look at the system and how they became who they became and what is keeping them alive, financially relevant, the same system, the same patron client system.
And what I find interesting in the comparison as well, as Jean pointed out, is that for a time, Putin too was seen as a steady pair of hands after Yeltsin and a potential reformer, liberalizer, popular in the West. And his center of support in Russia was included Muscovites and St. Petersburg cosmopolitans. But when political circumstances changed, he very quickly adopted a nationalist tone and program. And that seems to be a kind of default move that is available for aspiring authoritarians, right?
Yeah, it's not like they are reinventing the wheel. There's like a toolbox, and they're all going to that box and picking whatever is going to help them, and they are all using the same techniques and same strategies. And these are the guys who have been successful at applying and implementing those strategies. And the other reason, going back to one of the initial question in terms of like, then why these many people are supporting AKP, have been supporting AKP and voting for the party. There's really not just one single block. And Jane, you were extremely right on that, the heterogeneity of the supporters. It was more heterogeneous at the beginning, but still, you really cannot just find one group of people as the major supporter of the AKP government. You have the religious conservatives. You also have seculars who are very closely tied to government this way or that way, because this is their major source of revenue. They are not religious people. They actually do not practice religion in any major way that you will identify them as devout Muslims or anything like that. But they are tied to the system in other way. And they all have different motivations and different reasons for that, to support AKP, and there I can add 5-10 other groups of people into this mix.
Somebody from the chat raised this interesting point. So, obviously, when we think of autocracies, we think it's a one-man show, but a one-man show is enabled by his henchmen who have their own autonomy and power. People have noticed that Süleyman Soylu, the Yerli ve Milli Escobar, the interior minister, is completely absent from this state of affairs. Where is he? He's been touted as a potential successor to Erdogan. Erdogan's pretty old. There are rumors about cancer or what have you. Erdogan may die or have to leave office at some point, and there's a question of succession that will come up. And Süleyman Soylu has a very important role as the interior minister, which has vast police powers within the country. And you would think that as interior minister, he would be at the forefront of this. This seems like something that is in the remit of a very powerful ministry with a ton of different remits. Can you have you noticed his absence? What's going on with this?
I mean, I have my own theory, but I cannot prove that, right? My theory is that, and you are right, he has been touted as the legitimate alternative to Erdogan. Erdogan is gonna go sooner or later, and who is going to replace him? And they have been grooming Süleyman Soylu for that position, and I think he also has been grooming himself for that position. And my theory is that he knows, he's smart enough to know that if he shows his face, he's going to be attacked. Wherever he goes, he's going to receive more criticism than support. And he's trying to keep his face and his reputation as untarnished as possible behind the scenes, so other members of Erdogan's cabinet would receive the blow, would receive the hit. And when they all hate it very openly and criticize very openly, because everybody is attacking whomever they see on the ground. And then Süleyman Soylu is going to come and play the role of I am the savior.
It's interesting, though, that it does carry the risk for him, of course, though, that he may end up being the fall guy for this. I mean, people may not remember this, but there was bombing in Istiklal Caddesi in Istanbul. It was blamed on the PKK and YPG. Although that's very
shady, yeah.
Very shady. There's all kinds of discussions, even in well-respected Turkish newspapers like Cumhuriyet. I read in Cumhuriyet there's connections to the MHP. In Turkey has a history of false flag operations, as we know, and the term deep state was early adopted in Turkey long before it became popular in the United States. But Soylu got into trouble because he came out with some very harsh words about the United States, blaming America for this. And he was immediately kind of told off by Erdogan, right? People were like, oh my God, Turkey's going full blaming this on America. And then, he's kind of got above his station. He perhaps was, kraldan daha kralçı. He was more king than more royalist than the king, right? He in his vigor, because another important plank of AKP discourse has been a kind of kabuki anti-imperialism, where these guys are completely dependent on foreign capital. They're completely dependent on money pouring in from Europe, now from the Gulf, to sustain the unorthodox economic policies. And but for internal consumption, blaming all problems in the country on America has been a very a very useful strategy for the AKP, but it's a dangerous one, right? Like you can push it so far, but at the end of the day, you still want the American fighters.
Yeah.
You still need to have an open trade with Europe. You have to balance that. And Süleyman Soylu went a little bit too far in that discourse after the Istiklal bombing. Now, I think that's a very interesting theory that he may be trying to keep down low. But if we see in the next couple of weeks the press start beginning to criticize him, we'll see we'll know what's up, I guess.
Yes, definitely.
And there's all this discussion about his connections with drugs, cocaine, like diplomatic airplanes being used to bring drugs from Venezuela. And there's this nickname, I don't know, how would you translate yerli ve milli? Like indigenous Escobar, right? Like a locally produced Pablo Escobar.
Yes. No, that is true. And there have been a lot of discoveries on that front in terms of many members of the inner political circle and their entanglement with international drug trade, international drug networks. And one of the most famous and the funniest one was the son of a former prime minister, Binali Yildirim. His son got caught traveling from Venezuela. And he said that he was only taking COVID vaccinations and tests as a sign of help from Turkey to Venezuela, and there was no other reason for him to go. This was before This was before no serious vaccination efforts or no serious testing efforts whatsoever there, but they immediately tied it to the Turkish way of helping others and taking care of others and being the international help to wherever there is some group of people in need, and our helping hand is going all the way to Venezuela to take medication and vaccination and tests, COVID tests. Of course, nobody took that seriously. And I have a colleague who is from Venezuela, and he was telling me that, like, why does Turkish Airlines have flights from Caracas every day to Istanbul? Like, who is flying every day from Caracas with a huge plane to Istanbul?
Good question. Well, and drugs are like flooding the country, right? And I mean, there are all kinds of I mean, when I was in Turkey, drug use was very like didn't exist.
Yeah,
Well,
no, no.
I mean, there were bohemians who might smoke some hashish, or like, people would drink alcohol or what have you, but cocaine and
Yeah.
things like that.
Or fentanyl, or yes.
And there are all kinds of conspiracies that they're flooding the youth market with this to try and depoliticize them. Now, like, I am always wary of these kind of like conspiracies, but certainly people are making money. There was a well-known Turkish mafia boss who ran off to the Gulf and was telling all the stories about everybody.
Yeah.
What was his name? Peker.
Sedat Peker.
Yeah, he said that Peker. He was just sitting on, was it on YouTube or TikTok or something?
Yes, he was on YouTube, and he's quiet. He has been quiet. He hasn't been saying much, and a lot of people thought that what he was revealing was going to be the end of it, because he revealed so much of corruption, so much of dealings, illegal dealings of Süleyman Soylu. He really didn't attack Erdogan directly. All his enemy was actually Süleyman Soylu. But at the end, who lost? Erdogan's son-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
There was a huge competition and huge rivalry between Erdogan's son-in-law and Süleyman Soylu, and both of them were trying to create their own networks to pump them for being the next person. And Erdogan got rid of his own son-in-law on behalf of Süleyman Soylu, because my theory is that Süleyman Soylu has much more power within the police, within the army, within the people on the ground, and it was too risky to eliminate him as opposed to his own son-in-law.
And his son-in-law as well was not particularly popular because he was taking the fall for the for the economic policies in the country. Because I think the background to this, we've talked kind of about the political dimensions of everything, but there is a profound economic crisis taking place in Turkey, and Turkey is really between a rock and a hard place, because Erdogan is keeping the interest rates low. He's pumping money into the economy to try and keep, he has been pumping money into the economy to try and juice things before the election. He's been getting money from the Gulf to assist with this. He's taken all kinds of money from the Gulf, and but that's not a sustainable policy, right? The flip side is that they capitulate to international capital, and that means they're going to have to raise interest rates and throw millions of people out of work. So they're in this kind of perpetual crisis, either mass unemployment or mass inflation. And like, there isn't an out for them, right? There's no out for them. They just have to and I think Erdogan is probably ideologically committed to the interest rates thing. I think, he's got this whole thing about the faiz lobbyists, the usurers, right? He's like very much against like usury and things like that. And it's always, we all know he's talking about Jews, right? Even as he, even as he allows Turkey to serve as a major hub for the transfer of goods and military technology to Israel, it's never a bad thing to blame Jews for everything. And we just, we see this perpetual economic crisis where Turkey doesn't really have a way out that is not painful, right? Because people talk about, well, Turkey needs to follow economic orthodoxy, but that has a very painful cost for people in Turkey. which will be like huge unemployment in the
Yeah.
country. And
Yes.
that is probably less palatable to Erdogan, to have millions of unemployed people who have time on their hands to protest on the streets.
That is the big elephant in the room. Even if actually something happens and Erdogan leaves being the president, whomever is going to replace him, they are going to be in big trouble, and they are going to be blamed for a crash in economy, and even higher inflation, much higher. Whatever recipe that they are going to implement, it is going to have short-term disastrous effect, and they are going to suffer from it.
Well, we have been going for over an hour today, and I want to thank you, Aisha, for joining us today to talk about this really important topic. Now, you're doing some fundraising yourself. Would you be able to talk a little bit about that? I put the link in the in our description so that
Thank
people can
you.
see the Vimeo that you
Thank
have.
you.
So,
Thank
just
you.
can you talk a little
Yes,
bit about what
yes.
you're doing?
Yes, thank you. So, as many of us in the United States and in Europe, we have been trying to find a way to reach out to people who are directly affected by the earthquakes in Turkey, and with very little trust to the government and government-related agencies. There's only one right now initiative, the Ahbap. And a lot of people are sending their money through Ahbap, and I don't think they have the necessary infrastructure and power to handle millions and millions of liras and dollars that they are receiving. And in that case, I thought maybe I can start my own very humble initiative to collect some donations and reach out to people on the ground that I know through family and friends, and give the money directly to the people, to the families who are either lost their houses or businesses or family members. And in that, I just started this on Twitter, and it got picked up, and people have been extremely generous. And if you have any spare dollars around, I would love you to donate as well. We have identified over 50 families right now in earthquake hit places like Marash and Adıyaman, Malatya, Antakya, and Gaziantep, and we are going to give them the money, that just to be a small help, because actually um, the future is not bright, because even those who survived, they will have to rebuild everything from zero, literally. And we are just trying to be a small band-aid in a huge injury that they are suffering.
Yeah, and I think that's important to know. A lot of the aid that's taking place in the absence of, an adequate state response is, peer to peer. People literally helping their families. Many people in Europe, especially, come from this region. It was a prime area. I mean, I think of half of the community I know from London are either from Adıyaman or from Malatya.
Yes.
Like, or so people are helping any way they can, not just through charities but through peer to peer.
Yes.
So I would ask people to take a look at some of the places that we've put in our description, including Aisha's fundraising as well. I don't want to tell people to give to anything specifically on there, but take a look at them and see what you feel comfortable giving to. There's the Kurdish Red Crescent, which is working with people in Syria. There is the Ahbab I put on there. There's Hassan Abi, the streamer. He had a fundraiser that was very successful. There's Aisha's on there, and I think the Research Institute from Turkey. I've been given names by various people who I think are responsible. So like, people can look into things themselves, but I put some various things on there. There's also a link to an article in the USA Today, which has some places for giving. My personal opinion is, like, I don't trust Western aid organizations over local aid organizations. All aid organizations end up being corrupt. Just Google the Clinton Foundation, right? So, like, I'm perfectly comfortable myself personally giving to things like Ahbab and the Kurdish Red Crescent. But, again, people should look into it. And if they just have a few spare dollars, consider giving it. I've tweeted out a list of things on Twitter with the TIR account, so people can just like share that list that I put up there, add anything that you think is appropriate on there, and just basically get the word out. Because really, if when we're talking about the scale of a disaster, it's not a few thousand, it's not even tens of thousands. It could be as many as 100,000 people who could be dead, and many more who have lost everything. And it's not just affecting one. It's not just Turks. It's Turks, Kurds, Arabs. All these communities have a shared tragedy. Which if there is any silver lining, perhaps people will show some solidarity, and some of the hatred and the conflict that's in the region. Maybe this might serve as a kind of lesson about people's common humanities. Hopefully all talk of escalating conflicts in Syria will end as people focus on reconstruction. And I would add, people should not forget about Syria. I've seen a lot of people tweeting saying, oh, the Assad will steal all the aid money, and it's like, well, lots of aid organizations have shady practices, and also the crisis in Syria is exacerbated by the sanctions that are in that country, which doesn't allow reconstruction. As people know, I'm not a huge fan of the Assad regime, or the kind of apologia that certain people on the left do for the Assad regime, but there is no doubt that the international sanctions on Syria have greatly enhance the human tragedy that's taking place in that country as well. It can't just be laid squarely at the feet of the Assad government as well. So that would be just something else I would add as well. So please consider helping in any way you can, and we'll hopefully be able to follow up on this. Any last words, Derek and Kuba? No. Well, Kuba.
Just thank you for joining us, and I'm glad that we were able to have this conversation, especially since in a lot of mainstream media, it's been sadly overlooked.
And with that, as we say on This Is Revolution, we are out.